Hey there, my friend. For a long time, I thought taking note means I was learning. I would read a book, watch a video, highlight key points, write things down neatly, and I would close my notebook feeling productive. But then a few weeks later, sometimes even a few days later, I would come back to those notes and realize I couldn't actually use them. I couldn't explain the idea in my own words. I couldn't connect it to anything else I know. And if someone asked me about it, I would have to go back to the original source all over again. And that was frustrating because I did the work. I spent the time, I wrote the notes. So, if that's you, if you study a lot, save a lot, write a lot, but still feel things don't stick, I want you to know this upfront. You are not alone in this, and the problem is not your efforts. Well, let me tell you a thing. On paper, everything looks right. You are studying regularly, you are watching lectures, reading books, saving articles, you are taking notes, maybe a lot of notes. From the outside, it looks like you are doing exactly what a good learner is supposed to do. But on the inside, something doesn't match because despite all the efforts, when it's time to recall something for an exam, for a project, or even just for your own understanding, your mind feels blank. You recognize the topic, you remember seeing the idea before, but you can't quietly pull it out and use it, and that's where the frustration creeps in. You start to wonder, why does this feel so hard when I have already studied this? Why do I keep forgetting things I clearly wrote down? Am I just bad at remembering things? And here's the contradiction. You are putting in the work, but the result don't reflect the effort. And when effort doesn't lead to understanding, it quietly messes with your confidence. I remember one specific moment where this really hit me. I was teaching myself a new topic, watching videos, reading articles, taking notes along the way. I wasn't rushing, I was being careful. I even remember thinking, yeah, this time I'm going to do it properly. My notes look great, headings were there, key ideas were there, highlighted, important lines were copied exactly so I wouldn't miss anything. A week later, I wanted to explain one of those ideas to someone else. Nothing fancy, just simple explanation, and I couldn't do it. I opened my notes, scrolled through them, and realized something uncomfortable. Everything I had written was technically correct, but none of it sounds like me. It was just the source, rewritten or recopied, sitting there. In that moment, it became clear that my notes know more than I do. And what made that moment worse wasn't just the confusion, it was what it made me think about myself. When this happened often enough, you stop blaming the notes, you start to blaming yourself. You start to think, maybe I'm slow, maybe I'm not as sharp as other people, maybe I just don't get things the way I supposed to. There is this quiet anxiety that's built up, especially when you keep seeing other people move forward while you feel like you are revisiting the same topic again and again. And the worst part is that from the outside, it looks like you are doing everything right. You are studying, you are taking notes, you are putting in the time, so you don't feel justified questioning the process. You just assume the problem must be you. That's a heavy place to sit in as a learner. So, before we go any further, I want to say this clearly. If this is something you are struggling with, it's not because you are incapable of learning, it's not because you lack discipline, it's not because you haven't found the right app or method yet. What you are experiencing is surprisingly common, especially among people who actually care about understanding things properly. Most of us were never taught how to think with our notes. We were taught how to record information and we assumed that recording was the same things as learning. So if your notes feel empty or useless, that doesn't mean you failed. It just means something subtle in the process misaligned. And once you see that what it is, this whole thing start to make a lot more sense. When I finally went back and looked at my notes, I went back not to organize them, not to clean them up, but to understand why they were not helping me think. I realized it wasn't really writing notes at all. I was just copying the source, and that realization is where everything started to change. When I say that out loud, I was just copying the source, it sounds obvious, but at that time it really wasn't, because copying didn't feel lazy, it didn't feel careless, it felt responsible. I thought I was being true. I thought I was making sure I didn't miss anything important. So when I looked back at my notes, I wasn't looking for mistakes, I was looking for understanding. And that's when I started to notice a pattern that show up everywhere in my notes, across books, videos, courses, almost no matter what I was learning from. What I kept seeing was the same kind of note over and over again. Long paragraph from books, definitions say pasted word for word, screenshot from videos, highlighted stack upon top of highlighted. Sometimes I would rewrite things in bullet points, but even then the structure was mine. The thinking wasn't mine. Everything in the note came from the source, nothing came from me. That's when I start calling these source dump notes, because that's exactly what they are. You take whatever is in front of you and dump it into your notes, hoping that having it written down will somehow make it stick. And to be very clear, this isn't a rare mistake, this is the default way most of us were taught to take notes. The reason this kind of note taking stick around for so long is because it feels productive in all the right ways. When you copy something down, there is no ambiguity. You are not guessing, you are not risking being wrong. If the sentence came from a book or a lecture, it must be correct, right? So writing it down feels safe. There is also a very clear sense of completion. You finish a chapter, you finish a note, you highlighted the important parts, and your brain registered it as a progress. And honestly, this is how school train us. We are rewarded for accuracy. We are capturing the right answer, for writing what the teachers or the textbook says. So when we take notes this way, it feels like we are being disciplined learner. But none of this require us to stop and think. Copying let us move forward without ever asking whether we actually understand what we are writing. There is one note I still remember clearly. It was from a book I genuinely cared about, not something I was forcing myself to read. I spent time a full afternoon on it. I copied a few definitions. I highlighted passages that feel important. I even added headings so everything looked organized. When I finished, I remember thinking, okay, this is solid. I will come back to this later. A few weeks passed, then I opened the note again, not to review it casually, but because I actually needed the idea for something I was working on. And as I read through it, I felt this slow realization sink in. I could recognize every sentence, but I couldn't explain any of it. It was like rereading something in a language I almost know, familiar but useless. That's when I realized I had spent hours writing a note that never once asked me to understand anything. The problem with source dump notes is not that they are wrong. Most of time they are perfectly accurate. The problem is that nothing in them require your brain to do any work. When you copy a sentence, you don't have to decide what matters. When you highlight a paragraph, you don't have to interpret it. When you paste a definition, you don't have to understand it well enough to rephrase it. You are moving information, not processing it, and learning doesn't happen when information moves. It happens when your brain has to choose, questions, or connect something. So, source dump notes avoid all of that friction. They let you move forward quickly, but they leave no trace of thinking behind. So when you come back later, there is nothing there to trigger understanding, just information waiting to be processed for the first time. The real cost of this kind of note taking doesn't show up immediately, it show up later. It show up when you sit down to revise and realize you are basically starting from scratch. It show up when you reread the same notes again and again, hoping something will click, and it doesn't. It show up as the constant feeling that you are behind, even though you have been working consistently. And over time, it's create a really misleading feedback loop. You think the solution is to take more notes, save more content, be more thorough, so you double down on the very thing that is not helping. That's why this feels so exhausting. You are putting in real effort, but you are not building understanding. You are just postponing it. Friends, I want to be really clear about something here. There is nothing wrong with you for taking this way notes this way. This isn't a beginner problem, and it's not a sign that you don't know how to learn. This is what most of us were taught. In school, copying was rewarded, accuracy mattered more than understanding. If your notes match the textbooks, you were doing it right in their definition. So if source dump notes feel natural to you, that's not a personal failure. It's a learned behavior. I did this for years without questioning it. Most people never do. And the moment you stop blaming yourself is the moment this become fixable. So once I stopped asking how can I take better notes and started asking what are notes actually for, everything began to change, because the problem wasn't my discipline or my memory or the amount of note I was taking. It was the job I expected my notes to do, and that's the shift we need to talk about next. Alright, this was the moment where things finally start to make sense for me. Not because I discover a new method, not because I found a better way to organize my notes, but because I stopped trying to fix my note taking and start questioning the assumption underneath it. Up until the point I was focused on how to take better notes, clear notes, more complete notes, better looking notes. What I hadn't questioned was whether I was using notes for the right purpose at all, and once I noticed that, everything else started to fall into places. Here is the shift that changed everything for me. A note is not a record of what you consume, it's a record of what you understood. I want to say that again because it's easy to hear and miss. A note is not a place to store information, it's a place to capture your thinking. Once I saw notes this way, a lot of confusion around learning disappeared because suddenly notes were not something I was collecting, they were something I was using. Friends, recording feels simple. You see something, you wrote it down. There is a clear input and clear output, and it feels clean. Thinking doesn't feel like that. Thinking is slower, messier, and you hesitate more. You have to decide what matters. You have to admit when something doesn't make sense, yet you have to risk writing something incomplete or slightly wrong, and that's exactly why most of us avoid it. Recording lets you move forward without friction, thinking force you to slow down. But that friction is where learning actually happens. If your notes don't contain any friction, they probably don't contain much of thinking either. When I really sat with this, I realized something uncomfortable about my own notes. I wasn't trying to understand ideas, I was just trying to preserve them. I wanted my notes to be accurate, to reflect the source perfectly, almost like proof that I had done the work. But accuracy is not the same thing as understanding. I could write something that was completely correct and still have no idea how to use it. Once I saw that, I stopped judging my notes by how complete they were and start judging them by a simple question. Here is the question: does this show how I understand the idea? That question changed everything. Once I stopped treating notes as storage, their purpose became much clearer. A note is not there to capture everything. It isn't there to be complete, and it definitely not there to look impressive. A note is there to help you think. It's a place where you slow down just enough to figure out what is idea is actually mattered. That might mean the note looks rough. It might means it feels unfinished. It might even mean it raises more questions than answers. But that's not a problem. That's a sign that this note is doing its job. Friends, if this idea makes you a little uncomfortable, that's normal. Because the moment you stop copying and start writing what you think, a few fears show up immediately. What if I misunderstood this? What if I wrote something wrong? What if this isn't useful later? Those questions used to stop me too. Recording the source felt safer. If the note was wrong, at least it wasn't my fault. But here is what I learned it the hard way. This discomfort you are feeling isn't a sign you are doing it wrong. It's a sign you are finally doing the work learning required. So after listening to this, if you are thinking, okay, but now I'm not sure what should I actually write, that's okay. You don't need to write more, you don't need to be smarter. You don't need a better system. Nothing about this require you to overhaul how you study or throw away what you already have. The only thing that need to change right now is what you expect from a note to do. Once that expectation shift, what belongs in a note start to feel a lot less confusing. Once I understood that notes are for thinking, the next question become much simpler. It's not how do I build the perfect note, but what actually deserve to be written down. And when I looked at my notes through that lens, three things kept showing up again and again. That's what I want to walk you through next. Before we get into what actually belongs inside a note, I want to lower the bar on purpose. This isn't a framework, it's not a system, it's definitely not a rule book. You don't need to remember this perfectly and you don't need to apply all of it at once. Think of this more like a quick mental check, a way to ask, is this not doing its job? If a note has these few things, it's already useful, and if it doesn't, that doesn't mean you failed. It just means there is nothing there to help you think. Friends, everything I'm about to share come back to one simple idea. Your notes are not meant to store information, they are meant to capture your thinking. So instead of asking, do I write enough or do I cover everything? A better question is, does this not show how I understand the idea? Once you start asking that, what belong in a note become a lot clearer and a lot simpler than most people expect. So the first thing that belong inside a note is just one idea in your own words. Not the whole chapter, not the entire video, not every point the author made, just the part that made you stop. Most of us try to write everything down because we are afraid of missing something important. But when everything is written down, nothing stand out. Choosing one idea forces you to decide what actually matters to you, and the decision is where thinking begins. If you can't explain the idea in your own words yet, that's not a failure. That's a signal. It's your brain telling you this is the part worth slowing down. Friends, when I say one idea, I didn't mean something grand or perfectly phrased. An idea can be small, it might be a sentence that changes how you see something, a difference you hadn't noticed before, a claim you agree or disagree with. What it isn't is a summary of the entire source. If you find yourself writing paragraph, you probably recording again. A good test I use is this. If I came back to this note in a month, what's one thing that I would want to remember? That's the idea that belong in that note. A common worry here is, but what if I choose the wrong idea? I used to get stuck on that too. Well, let me tell you what helped me to let it go. If an idea caught your attention enough to make you pause, reread, or think for a moment, it's already worth writing down. You are not trying to predict what will be useful forever. You are just capturing what mattered right now. And if your understanding change later, that's not a problem. That's learning doing what it's supposed to do. The second thing that belong inside a note is one simple question or reflection. Writing an idea in your own words is great to start, but on its own it can still stay passive. A question is what brings the note to life. It creates a small pause, a moment where your brain has to engage instead of move on. When I started adding questions to my notes, they stop feeling like finished document and start feeling like conversations. Conversations with not the author, but with my future self. These questions don't need to be clever or deep. Some of the most useful ones I wrote are very simple. Things like why does this matter? When would this note will be used in my life? Sometimes it's even more basic. Do I agree with this? What part of this is still confusing? The point is not to answer the question perfectly right away. The point is to leave a trace of curiosity behind. Something that pull you back into the idea later. And it's completely okay if your question feels obvious or unfinished or even a little dumb. Most of the best notes I started with questions I couldn't answer them at that time. In fact, that's usually a good sign. If everything in the note feels clear and subtle, there is a chance you don't stretch your understanding at all. A question marks the edge of what you know. That edge is where learning actually happens. So don't wait for the perfect reflection, just write the one that's honest. The third thing that can belong inside a note is one small connection, and I want to emphasize this upfront. This part is optional, especially when you are just starting. You don't need to force a connection. When they do show up naturally, they make notes stick in a different way. A connection might be something you learned earlier, a note you already have, a real life situation, or even a mistake you have made before. You are not trying to build a network of ideas here, you are just giving your brain more handle to grab onto. The reason the reason connection help isn't because they make your notes more impressive. It's because your memory works through association. Ideas stick better when they attach to something you already know. A situation you have lived through, a concept you have struggled with before, a pattern you have started to notice. When I connect a new idea to a past mistake I made, I don't have to memorize it because the memory already has a weight. Even one small connection can turn a note from something you recognize into something you actually remember. This doesn't need to be polished. The connection doesn't need to be clever. It doesn't need to be perfect phrased. And it definitely doesn't need to turn into a whole web of ideas. One sentence is enough, sometimes even fragment is enough. If you feel yourself wanting to stop and do this properly, that's usually a sign you are drifting back toward recording instead of thinking. So keep it light, keep it simple. The goal is not to build a system, yet it's to leave a trace of thought behind. So when you zoom out, a useful note is actually very simple. It captures one idea in your own words, that the part that matter enough to stop you. It include one question or reflection, something that keep the thinking alive, and sometimes if it is feel natural, it add one small connection. That's it. If a note has those if a note has those things, it's already doing its job, not because it's complete but because it reflects how you thought about the idea. This can still feel a bit abstract when you only hear it described. So instead of explaining it further, let me show you what this actually looks like in practice. I will walk you through a real note I used to write and how I would rewrite it now using exactly what I just talked about. Friends, before I show you the note, I want to set the expectations properly. It's not a perfect note, it's not something I'm proud of, and it's definitely not an example you are supposed to copy. This is just a real note I wrote at that time and the way I would approach the same idea now. The point here is not to impress you, it's to make the difference visible. So first, let me show you the old note first. So this is what the note look like at first glance. It's actually seem fine. There is a definition copy straight from the book. Important lines are highlighted, headings are neat, and everything is grounded logically. If you just skim it, it looks like a good note. And at that time, that's exactly how I felt about it. I thought this was the what I studying properly look like. Capture the key points, organize them cleanly, and move on. There is nothing obviously wrong here. That's what makes this kind of note so deceptive. The reason a note like this feel good at that time is because it check all the boxes we have been taught to value. It's accurate, it looks organized, it match the source. If something else open if someone else opened this note, they would probably think, yeah, this note is solid. And that external validation matter more than we realize. There is also a sense of relief that come with this kind of notes. So you don't have to wrestle with the idea, you don't have to admit confusions, you don't have to capture what there, and you just have to capture what's there and move on. So your brain gets the signal, work done. That's why I don't question those notes for a long time. They felt responsible, even professional. But feeling productive isn't the same thing as building understanding, is it? So now let me show you how I would write this note now, not to make it perfect but to make it useful. I'm not changing the topic, I'm not adding more information, I'm just changing what I write down. So, first, one idea in my own words. Instead of copying the definition of a closure, I would write something like closures are confusing because the function keeps access to variables I expect to be gone. That's it. Not the notebook definition, just the part that actually mattered to me. The thing that caused confusion when I was coding. Now, the second part, one question or reflection. Right under that, I would add something simple like, when does this actually matter in real code? Or even, why did this bug happen when I used this pattern? I'm not trying to answer it perfectly, I'm just making the edge of my understanding. And finally, one connection if it is feel natural. For me, the connection was a past mistake. So I add, this is why my counter kept increasing even after the function finished running. And that's it. Three short lines, no formatting tricks, no long explanations. But now, when I come back to this note, it doesn't just tell me what a closure is, it reminds me why I struggle with it, where it actually show up. That's a thinking note. When you put those two notes side by side, the difference is pretty clear. The first note look better, it's clean, structured and complete. It feels like something you could hand to someone else. The second note looks rough, it's shorter, it's more personal. But here is the important part. There is the first note is quiet, it doesn't ask anything of you. The second note talk back. It reminds you what confused you, what mattered and where it show up. So even though it look worse, but it works better. And once you experience that difference a few times, it's harder to go back. A real a really common worry at this point is, but what if I forgot the other detail? I had that fear too. It feels risky not to capture everything, like you are throwing information away. But here's the shift that helped me relax. Your notes don't have to replace the source, the book, the video, the documentation. That's where the full information lives. Your notes job is different. It's there to help you remember what mattered, what confused you, and what you need. need to think about next. If you ever need the full details again, you can always go back to the source. But without a thinking note, you will keep going back as if it is the first time. Once I stop trying to make my notes complete and start making them useful, learning felt different. Honestly, it felt different. Not faster, not easier, but clear. And that clarity changed how I approached everything else: reading, studying, revising, even forgetting. So, to close this out, I want to zoom out one last time and talk about what notes are really for. That note example might look small on the surface, just a few notes written differently, but it represents a much bigger shift. The difference between treating note as storage and treating them as a thinking place. Friends, once I noticed that, I realized the problem was never about the topic I was learning or the amount of efforts I was putting in. It was the role I expected my notes to play in the process. And when that role changed, everything downstream started to feel lighter. So just to say it clearly one last time, notes are not archive, they are not proof that you studied, they are not meant to capture everything, they are thinking spaces. They are where you slow down enough to notice what you actually understood, what you didn't, and what's worth coming back to. If your notes do that, they are already doing their job, even if they look messy, even if they feel incomplete. Friends, at this point, you must be feeling strong temptation to do more, to go back and fix your old notes, to reorganize everything, to redesign your whole system. I felt that urge too. But you don't need to do any of that right now. You don't need to clean up the past mistake to learn better going forward. The only thing that matters is what you do the next time when you take notes. That's where the change actually happen. So here is a simple place to start. The next time you are reading something or watching a video, pause before you write anything down and ask yourself one question. What did I actually think about this? Then write just enough to answer that honestly. No more than that. You don't need to force depth. You don't need to make it perfect. Just leave a small trace of your thinking behind. This way of not taking focus on thinking instead of collecting, and it's also the foundation underneath everything I teach about learning. Structure, goal, system, all of those matters eventually, but none of it work as they should if this part come last. So if this video felt clarifying, this is not an accident. It's because once you fix how you think about notes, everything else become easier to place on top of that. Friends, what you can do next is check out the description and watch this next video in which I'm showing you how I take notes from books so that whatever I'm spending time on learning actually stick with me. Well, that's all I wanted to say for this video. Hope I see you in this next one. See you there.